There's a man in an apron somewhere in the upper ring of Ba Sing Se, having a mild disagreement with a customer about how long tea ought to steep. He's in his 60s, he's not especially fit, he's the sort of person you'd walk past without a second thought, unless he offered you a cup, in which case you'd probably take it. That man spent nearly 2 years trying to destroy the city he's now serving tea in. That's Iroh, and I've been thinking about him on and off for years, which is a slightly embarrassing thing to admit about a cartoon uncle. But here we are. Tonight I want to go through him properly. The son he lost, the song he sang, the lie he told the entire world about dragons, the crown he could have taken and handed away instead. And the tea, obviously. There's a lot of tea. If you're new to Avatar, don't worry. We'll build what you need as we go. And if you'd like to subscribe while you're settling in, that's lovely. But there's no hurry about any of it. Every family has one branch that everyone else talks about, in a slightly lowered voice. And in the world of Avatar, that branch is the Fire Nation royal family. Here's the shape of it. The world has 4 nations, roughly organised around the 4 elements, and about 100 years before the show starts, the Fire Nation decided it would be simpler if there were only one nation and it belonged to them. This was Fire Lord Sozin's idea. It involved, among other things, wiping out an entire people, which is the sort of detail the show introduces early and then lets sit in your stomach for the next 3 seasons. Sozin had a son, Azalon. Azalon had 2 sons. The younger one was Ozai, who becomes the villain of the whole thing. The older one, the firstborn, the heir, the one who by every rule of that family should have ended up on the throne, was Iroh. Hold on to that, it matters later, and I'm not going to make a fuss about it now. When we actually meet Iroh, none of this is visible. What we get instead is a middle-aged man on a metal ship near the South Pole, sitting at a table in the cabin, playing a board game while his nephew watches and drinking tea. He's accompanying his nephew, a teenage prince named Zuko, who has been banished from his home and told he can come back if he captures the Avatar. The Avatar has been missing for a century and is presumed dead by most sensible people. Zuko is looking anyway, so the premise of the first season, if you strip it down, is an angry 16-year-old chasing a ghost around the world, while his uncle treats the whole thing as an extended holiday, which he does, quite openly. Iroh wants to stop at the beach. Iroh wants to shop. Iroh finds a music night and stays for the music night. There's an episode where the ship is in genuine danger, and his contribution is to notice that the sunset is nice. I'll be honest about my first watch. I thought he was the comic relief. That's what he's built to look like. He's round, he's warm. He does the voice that older relatives do when they're pretending not to know how annoying they're being, and he loses at his own board game with tremendous enthusiasm. Every scene he's in gets slightly funnier for his presence. I clocked him as the guy who exists so the show isn't relentlessly grim, and I moved on. The thing is, the show tells you almost immediately that this reading is wrong, and it does it in a way that's easy to miss because the information arrives in the wrong tone of voice. Very early on, somebody refers to Iroh by his title. He's called the Dragon of the West. It's said with real weight, the way you'd say a name that soldiers know. And then the scene moves on, and nobody explains it, and you're left with this cheerful man in a robe who has apparently earned one of the most feared military reputations in the world. The show sits on that for parts of 3 seasons. 3. I want to flag it now because we'll come back to it much later, and I think the patience of that setup is one of the genuinely great pieces of writing in the series. Everything you assume the title means is wrong, and the show knows you'll assume it, and it lets you. There's another thing established early that I think is more important than it looks, which is that Iroh is regularly, cheerfully, completely wrong about things. The best example is a plant. Early in the second season, Iroh and Zuko are out in the wilderness, and Iroh spots some greenery and gets very excited because he's an enthusiastic amateur botanist in the way that people who love tea often end up being enthusiastic amateur botanists. He identifies it as a white dragon bush, which he explains makes a delightful tea. He's wrong. It's a white jade bush, which is extremely poisonous. And he brews it, and he drinks it, and he swells up like a balloon and nearly dies. I love this scene for a specific reason. The show does not turn it into a lesson. There's no moment afterwards where Iroh reflects on humility or the dangers of overconfidence. He's just a man who was very sure about a plant and was wrong about the plant. And now he's covered in a rash and being carried around by his nephew. That's the whole thing. Fiction is generally quite bad at wise characters, because it tends to protect them. The wise mentor is allowed to be gruff or mysterious or occasionally cruel, but they're rarely allowed to be simply mistaken about something small and get embarrassed about it. Iroh gets to be mistaken constantly. He gives directions that are wrong. He gets fashion advice wrong. He is confidently incorrect about plants, at least twice, in ways that have medical consequences. And the effect of that is that when he does say something genuinely useful, it doesn't land like a pronouncement from on high. It lands like a person who's been paying attention. There's a version of this character that doesn't work at all, and I think it's worth naming because the show came very close to it. If you strip the fallibility out, if you make Iroh serene and correct and untroubled, you get one of those hollow wisdom dispensers that exist to make the protagonist feel things. He'd be insufferable within 4 episodes. What saves him is that he's a bit of a nuisance. He's slow, he wants to stop for food, he plays terrible music loudly, he compliments people who have made it very clear they do not want to be complimented. Zuko is often correct that his uncle is being unhelpful, and the show lets Zuko be correct about that. So that's who we're starting with. A rounded, cheerful, slightly irritating old man on a ship who has a title he shouldn't have, a birthright he doesn't mention, and a habit of behaving as though nothing much matters. To understand why he's like that, you have to go back about 5 years before the show begins. To a wall, 600 days. That's how long the siege of Ba Sing Se lasted, and I want to strip the drama out of that number straight away, because it sounds cinematic, and the reality of it would not have been. That is nearly 2 years. It's 2 winters. It's the sort of duration where soldiers get bored and get sick and start families in the camp and develop opinions about the catering. Sieges are mostly waiting. Somewhere in there, a supply officer was worrying about grain. Ba Sing Se needs a bit of explaining if you don't know it. It's the capital of the Earth Kingdom, and it's less a city than a geological event. 2 enormous walls, one around the outer farmland and one around the city proper, and behind those walls, a population that had grown up genuinely believing they were untouchable. The wall had never been broken. That's the thing people said about it, in the way people say things about a place they've never had to test. Ba Sing Se does not fall. Iroh, at this point, was the Fire Nation's finest general and the heir to its throne, and he had decided he was going to be the one to take it. There's a detail in the background of all this that I find quite human, which is that Iroh had a vision earlier in life that he'd be the one to conquer the city. You can read that as prophecy if you like. I read it as ambition with a nice hat on. Plenty of successful people have had a moment where they decided what the shape of their life was going to be and then spent decades bending everything toward it. And he did it. That's the part that gets skipped. Iroh broke the outer wall, first commander in history to manage it. Whatever else is true about him, he was extraordinarily good at the job, and this was the summit of it, the thing that would have gone on the statue. His son was with him, Lu Ten, serving on the front lines, which is worth pausing on for half a second, because Lu Ten was a prince of the Fire Nation and a general's son, and generals' sons in most armies in most centuries have not been on the front lines. He was there because that's the sort of family they thought they were. Lu Ten was killed before they reached the inner wall, and Iroh stopped. That's the whole event. He didn't regroup, he didn't hand command to a subordinate, and go home to grieve and come back in the spring. He abandoned the siege and took the army home, and the campaign that his nation had spent 2 years and an enormous number of lives on simply ended. And this is the part I find hardest to get past. The single, most consequential decision in this man's life is a decision not to do something. He was winning. He was, by any reasonable reading, about to succeed at the thing he'd spent his career pointed at, and he put it down. We don't get to watch him decide. The show never shows us the moment. What we get is a brief flashback of a younger, thinner Iroh in armour, and a letter, and then the outcome. I think that's the right call. There's no dialogue that would improve it. The cost was total, and it arrived quickly. Back home, the abandonment was read exactly as you'd expect. A disgrace. A great general who lost his nerve. The Fire Nation's whole cultural machinery was built around the idea that strength is the only currency, and Iroh had very publicly run out of it in front of everybody. His standing collapsed, which is where his brother saw an opening. There's an episode in the second season called Zuko Alone, which aired in May 2006, and it's structured as a quiet little western. Zuko wandering into a village, saying almost nothing, helping a family who don't know who he is. Threaded through it are flashbacks, and one of those flashbacks is the ugliest scene in the family's history. Ozai goes to their father, Azalon, and makes a case. Iroh has failed. Iroh has no heir now, no son, nothing to pass a throne to, so the succession should come to Ozai instead. He does this while his brother is in mourning. That's the timeline. The body isn't cold, and Ozai is in the throne room doing the arithmetic. What I find genuinely interesting is that Azalon, who is not a good man by any measure, is disgusted by it. Not because he loves Iroh particularly, but because there's a limit even in that family, and asking to inherit off the back of your nephew's death is apparently past it. He is enraged, and he decides Ozai needs to understand what losing a son actually feels like, and he orders him to kill his own firstborn, Zuko. He orders Ozai to kill Zuko. That order is never carried out, because Azalon dies shortly afterwards, under circumstances the show is deliberately vague about, and Ozai takes the throne anyway, and Zuko's mother disappears from his life in the same night. But the point stands, and it's a horrible point. Every single thing that happens to Zuko across the entire series, the banishment, the scar, the desperate search for a boy in an iceberg, traces back through that room. And that room happened because Lu Ten died on a wall. Iroh, meanwhile, was not in the room. He was somewhere else entirely, being a father with nobody left to be a father to. I'm not going to try to explain what happened to him after that, partly because the show doesn't, and partly because I don't think it's the sort of thing that explains cleanly. Something in him reorganized. The man who came back from Ba Sing Se was not the man who went, and the difference wasn't that he'd become sadder. In some ways he became noticeably lighter. He got interested in tea. He got interested in strangers. He stopped caring about the throne to a degree that his own family found baffling and mildly insulting. People sometimes call this a breakdown, and I don't think that's quite it. A breakdown implies something stopped working. What actually seems to have happened is that a very specific structure, the one that told him what a life was for, which was conquest, honour, succession, the family business, came apart, and rather than rebuilding it, he left it down. There's a phrase psychologists use for this sort of thing, post-traumatic growth, and I have complicated feelings about it because it can be used to make suffering sound productive, which it usually isn't. Most loss just costs you, but occasionally someone loses the thing that was organising their life and discovers that the organising principle was the problem, and Iroh is the cleanest fictional example of that I can think of. He didn't get better, he got different, And the one time the show lets us actually watch him grieve, it does it in the most unassuming episode in the entire series. I want to come at this one from outside the show first because the production history is part of why the scene works, and I don't think you can separate them cleanly. Iroh was voiced by an actor called Mako, full name Makoto Iwamatsu, born in Kobe in 1933, and his life was already remarkable before anyone thought of putting him in a cartoon. His parents were artists who'd got themselves into trouble with the Japanese government in the 30s and ended up in the United States. And for a while, Mako was left behind with his grandparents while they sorted it out. He crossed over after the war. He served in the US Army during Korea. He trained at the Pasadena Playhouse. Then he spent 5 decades working across something like 165 productions. He was nominated for an Academy Award in 1966 for a film called The Sand Pebbles. He co-founded East West Players, a theatre company set up specifically because Asian American actors in that era were being handed a very short list of roles and someone needed to make longer ones. That's not a footnote. That's most of a life's work right there before you get anywhere near a children's animation about elemental magic. He died on the 21st of July, 2006 of esophageal cancer. He was 72. Now, the episode. The Tales of Ba Sing Se is the 15th episode of the 2nd season, and it aired on the 29th of September that year, so about 10 weeks after Mako died. Structurally, it's an odd thing for a show that was in the middle of a serialized run to attempt. It's 6 short vignettes, 1 per character, mostly unconnected, and almost nothing happens in the sense of plot. It's an anthology dropped into the middle of a war story. Iroh's segment is the second one, written by Andrew Huebner, and it is about an errand. That's it. Iroh goes out to buy some things. On the way, he does about 4 small acts of kindness, none of which take more than a minute of screen time. A baby is crying, so he sings to it, and the baby stops. 2 men have fallen out, and one of them is furious, and Iroh sits with the furious one and talks him down. A boy's ball has gone up into a tree, and Iroh, who is capable of levelling a building, gets it down by throwing his shoe at it. Then there's the mugging. A young man pulls a knife on him in an alley, and Iroh, rather than doing any of the several devastating things available to him, corrects the man's stance. He points out that his grip is wrong, and his footing is wrong, and offers to show him a better one. Then he asks him to sit down, and asks what he actually wants to do with his life. The lad admits he wanted to be a masseur. Iroh tells him he'd be a very good one, and pays him for a massage on the spot. 90 seconds. I've watched a lot of television, and I'm not sure I've seen a character established more completely in 90 seconds than that. He doesn't disarm the situation by being frightening. He disarms it by being curious about the person holding the knife, which is a much rarer instinct and considerably harder to fake. And then he walks up a hill. There's a tree. He sets out a small shrine, a picture, a few things he bought at the market. He arranges them carefully, the way you do when the arranging is the last available way to look after someone. And he says happy birthday to his son. Then he sings. I'm not going to reproduce the song, partly for reasons of who owns it, and partly because I don't think written down lyrics do anything for it. What I can tell you is that it's short, it's built like a lullaby, and it's addressed to a soldier being called home. It's the sort of song a parent sings to a small child, being sung by a man to someone who died as a soldier, which means the song is doing 2 ages at once, and both of them hurt. The music is by Jeremy Zuckerman, who scored the whole series and who is, I'd argue, doing about a third of the emotional work across all 3 seasons without most people noticing. It's under a minute. Mako sings it himself, unpolished, with the voice of a man in his 70s rather than a singer. And then the segment ends, and there's a card on screen, and it's a dedication in Mako's honour. Here's the thing I find hard to talk about without getting slightly clumsy. What's on screen is a fictional man grieving a fictional son. What's happening in the room for everyone who worked on it and everyone watching it after September 2006 is a real grief for a real person, sitting on top of the fictional one. The two of them are indistinguishable in the moment. You cannot separate the character's mourning from the show's mourning, and I think that's the reason this particular 3 minutes has outlasted almost everything else in the series. There's a version of that which would be cheap. Grief tourism, essentially, borrowing a real death to lend weight to a cartoon. It isn't that, and I've thought about why. I think it's because the scene was already written and already good. The dedication isn't propping it up, it just happens to be sitting next to it. Greg Baldwin took over the role afterwards. He'd been Mako's voice double for years, doing pickups and additional lines when Mako wasn't available, which is a strange job to have, and an even stranger one to have been quietly training for. He'd already covered a handful of Iroh's lines in the second season when Mako couldn't record, so the transition into the third season is less a recast than a continuation, and it's remarkably seamless. I'd wager a large number of people watch the whole show without noticing. Baldwin has been very clear over the years that he wasn't trying to replace Mako, and that he doesn't think anyone could. He's also said at conventions and on podcasts that he gets asked to sing that song, and he won't. Not out of precious ownership of the material, more that it belongs to somebody else and he knows it. I find that a decent piece of judgment. There's a lot of pressure on people in his position to give the crowd what they want, and he's held a line on the one thing that isn't his. The other reason I wanted to sit with this episode is that it tells you something structural about the character, which is that Iroh's grief is not an event in the story. It doesn't drive a plot, nothing changes because of it. He goes up the hill, he sings, and later on he's back at work in a tea shop being cheerful with customers. That's how it actually works, for what it's worth. People who've lost someone significant don't usually experience it as an arc. They experience it as a date in the calendar that comes round every year, and a hill, and an afternoon that's different from the other afternoons, and then Tuesday. The show understood that. It's a children's cartoon, and it understood that. Right, let's move to something that's genuinely quite funny, which is how bad Iroh is at his actual job. If you assess Iroh purely on outcomes, he is a catastrophic mentor for about 2.5 seasons. I mean this seriously. His entire job in the story is to guide one teenager toward being a better person, and for roughly 50 episodes, the results are dreadful. Zuko ignores him. Zuko shouts at him. Zuko abandons him. At one point, Zuko sets fire to things specifically because Iroh has suggested calm. And at the end of the second season, when it all comes to a head, Zuko chooses his sister and his father over his uncle and helps hand a city to an empire. By any normal metric, that's a failed mentorship. Compare that to how the role normally functions. Your Gandalf, your Obi-Wan, the authority in those relationships is underwritten by the plot. Events arrange themselves to confirm that the old man was correct, and the young person's suffering is the mechanism of confirmation. The audience is never invited to wonder whether the advice was any good, because the story has already decided. Iroh gets no such underwriting. He tells Zuko to let it go, and Zuko doesn't, and no thunderbolt arrives to settle the argument. The show simply proceeds, and for a very long time, it looks as though the uncle might just be wrong. Iroh doesn't get that guarantee. The story does not back him up. He tells Zuko to let it go, and Zuko doesn't, and the show doesn't punish Zuko for it in any tidy way. It just carries on. So what is he actually doing, if not instructing? Mostly he asks questions. That's the technique, once you notice it. Zuko announces a plan, and Iroh asks what he'll do when he gets there. Zuko says he needs his honor restored, and Iroh asks who exactly is meant to restore it. He almost never tells his nephew that he's wrong. He constructs the question that makes the wrongness visible and then leaves it in the room, and about 80% of the time, Zuko storms off without answering. The other thing he does is stay, which is easy to write down and much harder to do than the sentence suggests. Zuko is not pleasant to be around. He's not a misunderstood teenager who's secretly lovely underneath. He's genuinely unpleasant for long stretches, self-absorbed and cruel and exhausting. Iroh has money, standing, an entire nation he could return to, and a lifetime of reasons to go and sit somewhere quiet. He follows a hostile 16-year-old around the world instead on a boat for years, and then on foot as a fugitive, sleeping rough. And the reason this matters is the contrast with the other parent in the picture. Ozai's entire pedagogy is shame. That's not a reading, that's just what he does. Approval is a resource he withholds, and Zuko's whole personality is organised around trying to earn it back. The scar on his face is a teaching aid. That's the household this boy comes from. One where love is conditional on performance, and the conditions keep moving. Iroh does not do this once. Not once in the entire run. He is disappointed in Zuko sometimes, and says so plainly, but he never makes his presence contingent on Zuko improving. He never leaves and comes back to make a point. He never says any version of "prove yourself to me." And the reason I think this is the show's actual argument, rather than just a nice character trait, is what he does about the honour question. Everyone in Zuko's life treats honour as something external, something a father grants or removes, something a nation confers. Iroh is the only person who ever suggests that it might be Zuko's to define, and he suggests it so gently and so infrequently that it takes years to land. Then at the end of the second season, Zuko betrays him. The specifics are that they're hiding in Bussing Se. They've built something like a life, and Azula offers Zuko a way home. He takes it. He fights alongside her against the Avatar, against everything Iroh has been quietly steering him toward, and Iroh is arrested and imprisoned as a traitor, while his nephew is welcomed back to the Fire Nation as a hero. That's about as complete a rejection as you can write. Now, what Iroh does about that is the bit I want to sit with, because when they finally see each other again, much later, Zuko has come to apologise, and he has clearly spent weeks constructing the apology. He's rehearsed it. He's terrified. He's expecting, at minimum, to have to earn his way back in. And Iroh hugs him. After Zuko begins his apology, no conditions, no lecture, no "I told you so," which frankly he had earned the right to deliver. He tells Zuko he was never angry, only sad, because he was afraid he'd lost his way. And that's the end of it. They have breakfast. I'll admit this annoyed me the first time. It felt unearned. It felt like the show letting Zuko off. And there's a bit of me that wanted a reckoning, because Zuko had genuinely done real damage, and a hug seemed thin. I've come round, and here's what changed my mind. The reckoning had already happened. It happened off-screen in Zuko over months, and it was more thorough than anything Iroh could have imposed. If Iroh had made him work for forgiveness, the work would have replaced the change. Zuko would have had a task to complete, instead of a person to become, and he's exactly the sort of person who would have completed the task and learnt nothing. By withholding the punishment, Iroh leaves Zuko nowhere to put the guilt except into actually being different. That's a piece of judgment I don't think I'd be capable of. If someone I'd sacrificed years for handed me to my enemies, I'd like to think I'd forgive them eventually, but I'd want an accounting first. I'd want them to know precisely what it cost. Iroh skips the accounting, and I suspect he skips it because he's already done the sums on how little accounting achieves. The style of it is patience rather than instruction, and it's the only method in the show that works on Zuko, and it takes about 50 episodes. I've got a whole evening's worth of thoughts about Zuko himself, and that's a different video and probably a different night. Tonight, he's a supporting character in someone else's story, which is a slightly funny thing to say about the most famous redemption arc in modern animation. Not that Iroh never taught him anything concrete. He taught him one very specific technique, and it's my favourite piece of philosophy in the whole series, and it's smuggled in as a fight scene. Let's do the mechanics before the meaning, because the mechanics are satisfying. Lightning, in this world, is the highest expression of firebending. It's rare. Very few people can produce it. It requires a completely clear head, which is why Zuko can't do it. He's a bundle of unresolved everything, and the technique demands the opposite. His sister can do it easily, which tells you what you need to know about the two of them. So Iroh teaches him the other half instead, lightning redirection. The idea is this: if someone throws lightning at you, you don't block it, because you can't. You accept it. You take it in through the fingertips of one hand, guide it down the arm, through the stomach, and out through the other hand and away. The stomach part matters, and Iroh is very specific about it. The energy has to go through the stomach and not the heart, because through the heart, it kills you. The stomach is where he says the energy actually lives anyway. Physically, the movement is a slow curve. You're not resisting anything. You're giving the lightning somewhere to go. And the detail I love, the one that turns a fight technique into a whole philosophy, is where he got it. Iroh developed lightning redirection by studying waterbending. Sit with that for a second. This is a highly respected Fire Nation general. During a war of conquest that his own family started, spending his private hours studying the martial art of the people his army is currently killing. Because waterbending is better at one particular thing, at not meeting force with force, at taking what's coming and turning it, and he wanted that thing, and the only place to get it was from the enemy. He says as much when he's teaching it. His position, stated in that episode, is that the 4 elements are one thing that people have artificially divided up, and that firebenders have made themselves smaller by refusing to learn from the other 3. He's not being mystical about it. He's making a fairly dry professional observation, which is that a discipline that won't read outside its own literature will eventually stop improving. The episode is called Bitter Work, and it aired in June 2006, and I'd flag that the whole episode is about learning being unpleasant. Aang is failing to learn earthbending in a parallel storyline. Nobody is having a nice time. Now, what makes this politically remarkable, rather than just technically clever, is what it means inside a nationalist war. The entire Fire Nation project rests on the claim that they're superior. Not stronger superior, that their element is the best element and their people are the most advanced, and the conquest is essentially a favour they're doing the world. Sozin says a version of this out loud. It's the founding lie, an honest admission that the water tribes understand something firebenders don't isn't a tactical note, it's heresy. It undercuts the justification. If the enemy has better ideas about anything, the whole architecture wobbles, and there's a reason authoritarian projects historically get very nervous about their scientists reading foreign journals. Iroh, so far as I can tell, just didn't care. He wanted the technique. The technique was over there, so he went and got it. That's not framed as an act of resistance. It's framed as a man being interested in something. I've turned over how this maps onto ordinary life, and the honest answer is that it maps almost too neatly onto every field I've ever been near. Expertise calcifies. People spend 15 years getting good at one way of doing something, and then spend the next 30 defending the borders of it. You see it in academia, you see it in trades, you see it aggressively in software. The specific move Iroh makes, going and learning from the group you've defined yourself against, is easy to describe and quite hard to actually do because it requires admitting the definition was doing work for you. There's another layer here that I only noticed on a rewatch, which is the choice of what to teach. Iroh can generate lightning. He's one of the few who can. He is fully capable of teaching Zuko the offensive version, or at least the theory of it, and he explicitly doesn't. Zuko asks. Iroh says no, and gives him the defensive form instead. You cannot start a fight with lightning redirection. It's a technique that only functions if someone has already attacked you. It's purely responsive. The man has an offensive weapon of enormous power in his back pocket, and what he hands his nephew is the version that can only ever be used to survive. I don't think the show underlines that, and I'm glad it doesn't. There's a real philosophical tradition sitting underneath all this, and I'll gesture at it without turning the lights on too brightly. The idea of yielding as a form of strength runs through a lot of Chinese thought, particularly the Taoist material, where water is the standard image precisely because it's the softest thing available, and also the thing that eventually wins arguments with rock. Wu Wei, the phrase people usually translate as non-action, is closer to acting without forcing, moving with what's already happening rather than against it. Avatar draws on this quite openly. The martial arts in the show are based on real styles, and the elemental philosophies aren't decoration. But I like that Iroh's version arrives as a practical lesson rather than a sermon. He doesn't tell Zuko about water as a metaphor for the yielding spirit. He tells him where to put his hand, so his heart doesn't stop. The technique gets used twice more in the series in ways that matter, and I'll keep this brief because I don't want to spoil the shape of things for anyone watching fresh. It saves Zuko's life, and it eventually reaches Aang, which means that the thing that decides the largest confrontation in the story is an idea a Fire Nation general copied off the Water Tribes because he thought they'd worked something out. There's a quiet joke in that, and the show never tells it. And that's the second time in this script that we've hit the same pattern with Iroh, though I'll only name it once and then leave it alone. He acquires something from a place he's supposed to be at war with, and he doesn't tell anyone where he got it, and the world carries on, assuming he's exactly what it thinks he is. Which brings us neatly to the biggest thing he never told anybody. Here's what the entire world believed about Iroh for most of his adult life. Dragons were the first firebenders. Not the first firebending animals, the first full stop. Humans learned it from them. In the older, stranger religious layer of this world, that's where fire comes from as a technique, and there were people called the Sun Warriors who learned it directly, thousands of years before the Fire Nation existed as a nation. Then Sozin decided dragons were a problem, or more accurately, decided they were an opportunity. He made hunting them the highest honour available to a firebender. Kill a dragon, and you earn the title dragon, and there is no more prestigious thing to be. So they were hunted industriously for decades until there weren't any left, and the man credited with killing the last of them is Iroh, hence Dragon of the West. That's what the title means. It means he found the final 2 dragons in the world, and he saved the species by pretending to have ended it. Everyone believes this. It's stated as fact by his own family. Zuko believes it and repeats it. It's the sort of thing you'd assume was settled, because who would lie about that in the direction of making themselves look worse? The truth arrives in the 13th episode of the 3rd season, The Firebending Masters, which aired in July 2008 and was written by John O'Brien and directed by Giancarlo Volpe. It's the 53rd episode of the show. That's how long they sat on it. The Sun Warriors are not extinct. They've been hiding, quite successfully, for a very long time, and the last 2 dragons, Ran and Shaw, are alive, kept safe by them, and what those dragons do to people who find them is not eat them. They judge them. If you're found worthy, they breathe a fire over you that isn't a weapon. It's every colour at once. And what it teaches you, if you're paying attention, is that fire isn't rage. Fire is energy. Fire is life. The Fire Nation's version, the one built on anger and hatred, is a degraded copy that lost the original meaning somewhere in the last century. Iroh made that trip years earlier. He found the Sun Warriors, he faced Ran and Shaw, and he passed. They taught him. He learned the true form of firebending from the last 2 dragons alive, and he learned an old movement form called the Dancing Dragon, which he then quietly folded into his own fighting style where nobody would think to look for it. And then he walked out and told the world he'd killed them. The reason is simple, and it's the sort of thing you only think of if you're genuinely good at strategy. As long as there might be a dragon left, someone will keep hunting. The hunt only stops when the prize is gone. So he claimed the prize. He announced that the last dragons were dead by his hand, which meant there was nothing left to find, which meant every ambitious young firebender in the nation stopped looking. He ended the dragon hunts by becoming, in the public record, the greatest dragon hunter who ever lived. I've thought about the cost of this more than is reasonable. He accepted a permanent reputation as the man who exterminated a species. Not a temporary cover story, permanent. Everyone he met for the rest of his life knew him as that. It's the first thing said about him. It's not how he's introduced. And there's a version of that which is fine if you don't much care what people think, but Iroh clearly does care about some people. And one of them is Zuko. And Zuko spent his entire childhood being told that the greatest thing a firebender can do is kill a dragon, and that his uncle did it. Iroh let his nephew believe that about him. For years, living on the same boat, there's a scene in the 3rd season where Zuko, retelling the family history to Aang, says it flatly, his uncle killed the last dragon. He's a bit embarrassed about it actually, because by that point he's started to see the shape of what his family has done. And Iroh isn't there to correct him, and wouldn't have if he was. Fiction is absolutely stuffed with characters who are desperate to be understood. That's most of drama, arguably. The misjudged hero, the falsely accused man, the person whose whole arc is aimed at the moment when everyone finally sees what they really are. It's such a reliable engine that we barely notice it as a convention. Iroh built a lie that made him look monstrous, and then didn't take it back, and there is no scene in the series where he clears it up. Aang and Zuko work it out for themselves by making the same journey he made, and they keep the secret too, which is a nice touch. The Sun Warriors don't ask for a promise so much as assume one, and everyone who's ever passed that test has understood. There's a smaller detail in that episode I find quite funny in a bleak way. The Sun Warrior chief tells Zuko that his ancestors are the reason the dragons vanished. And he's not wrong. That's Sozin. But by the show's own logic, the reason 2 dragons are still alive to be indignant about the family is Zuko's uncle. The same bloodline contains both the extinction and the exception. What I take from this section, if I'm taking anything, is a rather uncomfortable question about reputation. Most of us do a certain amount of maintenance work on how we're seen. Small corrections, clarifications, the mild steering of a story about ourselves that's drifting somewhere unflattering. It's automatic. You barely register doing it. Iroh made one enormous permanent contribution to that story in the wrong direction, on purpose, because the misunderstanding did protective work that the truth couldn't. And then he lived inside it, cheerfully, for the rest of his life, serving tea to people who thought they knew exactly who he was. I'm not sure I could do it. I think I'd crack within a year and tell one person, just so it existed somewhere. He was, by this point, keeping quite a lot of things to himself, and one of them wasn't a secret so much as an entire organisation. The most important underground network in the world identifies its members through an opening move in a tile game, and I'd like everyone to sit with how funny that is before we get to why it's actually rather profound. The game is Pai Sho. It's played on a circular board with tiles, most of which represent plants, and it's the sort of game that old men play in the corner of a shop for 6 hours while the tea goes cold. Iroh plays it constantly. He plays it against himself. He plays it against people who have made it clear they don't want to play it. In the 1st season, he carries the board around on a warship, and it reads as a character quirk, the kind of thing you'd give an old man to make him feel lived in. It isn't a quirk, it's the whole apparatus. There's a tile called the White Lotus. It's not a strong tile, mechanically. Iroh describes it at one point as one that most players find useless and discard. If you open a game by placing it in the centre of the board, and your opponent responds in a particular way, you've just identified yourselves to each other. The right reply is a phrase about how those who cling to the old ways can always find a friend. And then you're not two strangers in a tea shop anymore. You're members. The Order of the White Lotus is transnational, considerably older than the war, and organised around the idea that philosophy, beauty, and truth don't stop at borders. Its members are philosophers, teachers, and warriors drawn from all four nations. It has no interest in who won which battle. It's the sort of organisation that would have looked completely irrelevant for about 90 years of the 100-Year War, and then turns out to have been the only serious international body left standing. Practically, it's also a network of favours, and Iroh uses it as one. When he and Zuko need to get into Ba Sing Se as refugees, the way in is forged passports supplied through the Order. So there's an unglamorous logistical dimension to all of this. It's a philosophical brotherhood, and it's also a group of well-connected old men who can get you papers. Iroh is Grand Lotus, which is the top of it, and when you eventually see the membership assembled, it is one of my favourite images in the entire show, because it's four old men, and none of them should be in a room together. There's Bumi, the king of Omashu, 112 years old, who has spent the war under Fire Nation occupation, and who is, by any diagnostic standard, completely deranged in a way that turns out to be tactical. There's Paku, the waterbending master from the Northern Water Tribe, an enormous snob who spent the first season refusing to teach girls and had to be publicly challenged into changing his mind. There's Pian Dao, a swordmaster from the Fire Nation itself, and there's Zhong Zhong, a firebending master who deserted the Fire Nation army, which in that culture is not a career move so much as a suicide note. So, an occupied king, a reformed reactionary, and two Fire Nation men who walked away from the project. Plus Iroh, who ran the project's most famous campaign. These men chose each other. That's the bit. Nothing about their circumstances threw them together. They're from opposite ends of a world at war, and several of them have every reason to hate the others on principle. They found each other deliberately, over decades, one board game at a time, because they were interested in the same things. Here's what I think the show is doing with this, and it does it entirely without a speech, which is why I trust it. Avatar has a nationalism problem to solve, in the sense that it has to make an argument against it that a 9-year-old can follow and an adult won't find embarrassing. The lazy version is a character standing up and saying that we are all the same underneath, which is true and completely inert as drama. Nobody has ever changed their mind because of that sentence. What the show does instead is show you a friendship group. It says, here is what it actually looks like when people decline the categories. It looks like four old men who play a board game and have opinions about tea and would be quietly devastated if one of them died. And there's a second point layered under it that I only clocked recently, which is that wisdom in this series is depicted as a network rather than a possession. Nobody gets wise alone in Avatar. That's actually consistent across the whole show. Aang has the past avatars and Guru Pathik and a whole monastery behind him. Katara has Paku, eventually. Toph learned from badger moles, which is very funny, and also entirely serious. Zuko has Iroh, and Iroh, the wisest person in the story, has an entire international society of people he goes and talks to, plus the Sun Warriors, plus 2 dragons. The lone sage on the mountain is a fantasy the show simply doesn't offer. Every piece of insight anyone has in this world was handed to them by somebody else, and then adapted. Iroh's calm is not something he generated internally. He collected it. I find that a much more honest picture than the alternative. The people I'd describe as genuinely wise, the handful I've met, all had a similar quality of having been assembled out of other people. They quote their old boss. They mention a book. They tell you what their grandmother said about it. The idea that anyone arrives at a settled view of the world by sitting alone and thinking hard is, in my experience, mostly something you believe when you're 22. There's a slight wobble in all this that I want to name, because I don't think the Order is beyond criticism. They spent the war doing essentially nothing visible. 5 extraordinarily powerful people, one of them a king, and their contribution to 90-odd years of conquest was to keep a philosophical tradition alive and play tiles. When they finally do move, they move decisively, and it matters. But you could reasonably ask what they were waiting for. I think the honest answer is that the show needed them not to have solved it, and the in-world answer is that a secret society that acts too early stops being secret and stops being anything, which is a real strategic argument, and also the sort of argument you'd expect from people who've become quite comfortable with waiting. I'll leave that there rather than prosecuting it, but I don't think it's nothing. One last detail, and it's a small pleasure. The Order is still going a lifetime later in the sequel series, having grown into something much larger and more institutional, a proper organisation with uniforms and compounds and a public role, which is exactly what happens to every countercultural network that succeeds. We'll come back to that world at the end of tonight, and it started as a way for a few people who disagreed with their governments to recognise each other over a board game, using the tile everyone else threw away. Speaking of waiting, and of people who look like they're doing nothing, picture an old man in a cell. He's sitting with his back to the door. He's eating, mechanically, out of a bowl. He doesn't turn round when someone comes in. He doesn't respond when he's spoken to. He's dirty, his hair has grown out, and he's clearly put on weight in a place where prisoners usually lose it. When a guard mentions him, the tone is somewhere between pity and contempt. He's the crazy old man in the cell. That's Iroh for most of the 3rd season, and it's very nearly the last we see of him. The background is this. After Ba Sing Se falls and Zuko sides with his sister, Iroh is taken back to the Fire Nation in chains as a traitor, which is exactly what he is by their law. He fought against his own nation's forces in a foreign capital. He helped the Avatar's people escape. There is no defense available. Zuko comes to see him. This is one of the more painful scenes in the show, and it's painful because of how ordinary the cruelty is. Zuko is home, he has everything he thought he wanted, and it isn't working. And he goes down to the cells because on some level, he wants his uncle to explain why. And Iroh won't look at him, won't speak. Zuko shouts and gets nothing and leaves. I've seen people read that as Iroh finally punishing him, and I don't think it is, though I understand the reading. I think it's a man in an appalling situation who has nothing useful to say yet, and has decided not to say the useless things. But it lands as rejection, and it's the only time in the series he lets it. Meanwhile, in that cell, absolutely nothing is happening. Except that it is. He's eating everything they bring him, all of it, greedily, which is why the guards think he's gone to seed. He's training, every day, in a cell, with no equipment, in the manner available to someone with a small stone room and unlimited time. And he's doing this while presenting, to everyone who looks in, as a broken old man who has given up. He's waiting for a date. He already knows the date because half the world knows the date. There's going to be a solar eclipse, and during a solar eclipse, firebending stops working. Every firebender in the nation, including the Fire Lord, including the guards on his door, will be an ordinary person for a few minutes. When it comes, Iroh gets up and takes the prison apart. He is not a firebender at that moment. It doesn't matter even slightly. He goes through the wall and then through the guards, and the show gives you about 30 seconds of a man who's been sitting in the dark for months, moving like something being released. And it is genuinely a bit alarming after 20 episodes of him being cuddly. Then he walks out and disappears, and nobody catches him. What I like about this stretch is that it's the cleanest illustration in the show of a distinction that gets muddled constantly, which is the difference between passivity and patience. They look identical from outside. That's the entire problem with them. someone who has given up, and someone who is waiting for the correct moment, present exactly the same way. To an observer, nothing is visibly happening. No progress is being reported, no effort is on display. Our whole culture is set up to reward the visible version of effort, which means we're quite bad at telling these apart, and we tend to assume that the person who isn't doing anything obvious has stopped. Iroh spent months looking like a man who had stopped. He had a date in mind the entire time. And there's something in that about the shape of his whole life, actually, because he does this repeatedly. He spends years on a boat looking like a man on holiday. He spends months in a tea shop looking like a man who's found his level. Every long stretch of apparent nothing in Iroh's story turns out to contain something. And the reason you don't see it is that he's genuinely enjoying the nothing while it's happening. That's the trick. And I don't think it's a trick he could fake. If he was secretly miserable and pretending, someone would have noticed. Which brings us to the wall again. At the very end of the war, with a comet arriving that will make every firebender temporarily unstoppable, the Order of the White Lotus assembles outside Ba Sing Se, and Iroh leads them in. The city is under Fire Nation occupation at this point. He breaks the wall for the second time in his life. Same man, same wall, opposite reason. I want to be careful with this bit because it's the closest the story comes to a triumphant beat, and I don't think it plays that way, or should. There's no swelling moment where he stands on the rubble. He does the job, competently, in a slightly workmanlike fashion, as a man finishing something he'd left half done a long time ago and never quite got round to. The vision he had as a young man, the one about being the man who takes Ba Sing Se, turns out to have been correct and completely wrong about the meaning. He does take it. He takes it back and hands it to the people who live there. I've read the whole thing described as a redemption of the siege, and I'd push back on that slightly. Redemption implies the ledger balances, and it doesn't. The people who died in those 2 years are still dead, and the city being liberated by the man who besieged it doesn't undo that, and I don't think Iroh imagines it does. What it does is give the second half of a life a shape that answers the first half, which is a smaller and more realistic thing. The moment I actually like is the conversation just before it. Zuko asks him what he's going to do afterwards, after the war, after all of it, and Iroh says he'll reopen his tea shop and play Pai Sho every day. That's it. That's the retirement plan of the most dangerous person on the field. He's about to lead an assault on the largest city in the world, at the head of a secret society of masters, during a once-in-a-century celestial event. And what's actually on his mind is whether the shop will still be standing and whether he can get his old table back. I think that answer is meant to be funny, and it is. I also think it's the most straightforwardly sincere thing he says all season. Because there's a question hanging over him at that point that everyone in the room can see and nobody wants to ask, which is what happens to the throne. Let's do the paperwork on this because I think people underrate how strong his position actually was. Iroh is the firstborn son of Fire Lord Azulon. In a hereditary monarchy, that's not a preference. That's the rule. The throne was his by birth, and everyone in the nation knew it. His younger brother acquired it through a combination of opportunism and a death that the show goes out of its way to leave suspicious, at a moment when Iroh was too deep in grief to contest anything. It was, at absolute minimum, irregular. So he has the claim. He also has, by the end of the war, everything else you'd need. He has the military reputation, which in that culture is the only currency that really counts. He has an international secret society of masters standing behind him, several of whom are heads of state, or close to it. He has just personally liberated the Earth Kingdom capital, which means the Earth Kingdom owes him and would be delighted to see him installed. He is the only member of the royal family not implicated in the final phase of the war. The Fire Lord has been deposed. The heir apparent is his niece, who by this point has come apart quite badly. If Iroh had said the word, there is nobody in the world in a position to say no. He's offered it, explicitly, and he turns it down and tells Zuko to take it instead. His reasoning when he gives it is characteristically undramatic. He says the people would never accept the throne from him, because his destiny was Ba Sing Se, and he has now fulfilled it. He says Zuko is the one who can restore the nation's honour, and that his own destiny was Ba Sing Se, and he's now done it. I've always found the first part of that slightly evasive, honestly. It's a practical argument, and it's not wrong, but it's the kind of argument you produce when you'd rather not say the simpler thing, which is that he didn't want it. He hasn't wanted it since he was about 40. The practical reasoning is a courtesy to a room full of people who would find the real answer strange. Now, why does this matter more than it looks like it should? Because renunciation only means anything if you could have had the thing. This is the bit that gets lost when people talk about humility or letting go, and it's why an enormous amount of writing about simplicity is worthless. Someone with no options who declares that they never wanted the options isn't renouncing anything. They're describing their circumstances and calling it a philosophy. It's extremely common and it's extremely comforting, and it isn't the same act at all. Iroh had the throne available, not theoretically, practically, that week, with the backing to hold it, and he handed it to a 16-year-old with a burn on his face and no political experience whatsoever, and then went to check on his shop. Set that against the rest of the family, and the contrast does the work without anyone having to comment on it. Ozai wanted the throne so much he made a case for it over his nephew's grave, and then, having got it, and with plans to conquer the world, decided that being Fire Lord wasn't enough, and gave himself a bigger title. Azula wanted it so badly that the anticipation of it is what breaks her. She gets handed the crown and immediately begins to disintegrate, because the thing she'd organised her entire personality around turned out not to be load-bearing. That family had exactly one recognised form of ambition, and the show quietly demonstrates that everyone who pursued it ended up worse off than when they started, and the eldest son looked at the same object and found it boring. Not evil, boring. That's the read I've settled on. Iroh doesn't seem to regard the throne as a temptation he heroically resisted. He seems to regard it as an enormous amount of admin. Now I want to complicate this before it curdles into a lesson, because there's a bit in the comics that I think saves the whole thing from being sanctimonious. Sometime after the war, Zuko needs to leave the Fire Nation for a while on personal business, and someone has to mind the shop. So Iroh, briefly, becomes acting Fire Lord. He has the actual job, absolute authority over the most powerful nation in the world, for a limited period, with no oversight. And he's bored within about a week. Deeply, visibly bored. The paperwork is dull, the meetings are dull, and the whole apparatus he refused turns out to be exactly as tedious as he'd suspected. So he uses the unlimited power of the Imperial throne to declare a National Tea Appreciation Day. I love this so much I've thought about it while doing the washing up. It's the perfect gag because it's also a complete argument. Give this man the machinery of empire, and he will point it at tea, not out of protest, not to make a statement about power. He's just genuinely more interested in the tea, and the machinery was sitting there, and it inoculates the whole refusal against nobility. If Iroh had turned down the crown solemnly, and then spent his retirement radiating serene virtue, he'd be unbearable. Instead he turned it down, took it briefly by accident, found it dull, invented a national holiday about a hot drink, and gave it back. There's a word I keep circling and I'll use it once and then leave it alone, which is enough. Not enough as a consolation prize. Not enough as the thing you tell yourself when the bigger thing didn't happen. Enough as a position you can actually arrive at and hold, having seen what the bigger thing costs and having concluded it isn't worth the price of admission. The reason Iroh can hold that position credibly is that he did the other version first. He spent decades wanting the largest possible thing. He got closer to it than almost anyone, and it cost him his son, and he put it down and never picked it up again. The tea shop isn't a fallback. It's a conclusion he reached the hard way and then stuck to for 5 years while being repeatedly offered alternatives. There's a version of Iroh that never went to Ba Sing Se, who's just a pleasant man who likes tea and doesn't much care for politics. That man would be fine. He'd also be completely unremarkable, and none of us would be talking about him at 1 a.m. The whole thing only works because he could have been the other thing and stopped. And what he did with the rest of it, once the war was over and the crown was on somebody else's head, was reopen a shop and complain about how everybody else makes tea. The most revealing thing Iroh says in the entire second season is a complaint about a beverage. The situation is this. He and Zuko have arrived in Ba Sing Se as refugees. They have nothing. They're travelling under false names, using papers that identify them as Earth Kingdom citizens, and they are technically 2 of the most wanted people alive. Iroh gets them jobs as waiters in a small tea shop in the Upper Ring, which is exactly the sort of anonymous, unremarkable position 2 fugitives should want. And on the first day, he tastes the tea and he cannot let it go. He tells his nephew, out loud, in the shop, that what they're serving is nothing more than hot leaf juice. Zuko, who is trying very hard to be invisible and is having a horrendous time, points out that it's just tea. Iroh's response is that his nephew is a horrible, miserable person who clearly hasn't understood the fundamental point. Now, on one level, this is a joke, and it plays as one. On another level, it's a man risking a manhunt because the brewing is wrong, and I don't think the show is unaware of that. What follows is one of my favourite small arcs in the series, and it's a workplace arc, which is not something you expect from a fantasy epic. Iroh takes over the tea. The tea gets better. The shop starts filling up. Word travels. A wealthy man from the Upper Ring hears about it, comes down, tastes it, and offers Iroh his own establishment with complete creative control and a flat to go with it. His current employer counters by offering to promote him to senior executive assistant manager, which is the funniest line in the episode and possibly the season. Iroh takes the new shop, and he names it the Jasmine Dragon. The naming scene is short, and it's the one I want to sit on, because he gives 2 reasons, and both of them are sincere, and they don't quite fit together. The first reason is that it's dramatic and poetic, and it has a nice ring to it. That's the whole justification. He likes how it sounds. There's no deeper agenda. He's a man who thinks names should be enjoyable, and he's enjoying this one. The second reason, which comes out elsewhere, is about jasmine tea specifically, and about balance, and about the idea that where there's balance, there's peace, which is a genuine philosophical statement from a man who has thought about this a great deal. Both of those are true at once, and I find that combination very human. He's not choosing between a profound reason and a frivolous one. He has both simultaneously, and doesn't experience any tension between them. Most people I know who are actually interesting are like this. They have a considered position on the thing, and they also just think it's nice. Right? Let's do the philosophy, and let's do it without the wellness vocabulary, because there's a version of this section that turns into a candle advertisement, and I'd rather not. The thing the show's drawing on here, whether or not it thought about it in these terms, is that tea in the cultures Avatar borrows from is not a beverage. It's a practice with a literature. There are texts about it going back well over 1,000 years, arguing about water temperature and vessel material and the correct order of operations, and the entire enterprise rests on a premise that sounds mad if you say it flatly. That doing one very small thing with complete precision is a legitimate way to spend a life. That's what Iroh is doing behind the counter. Not relaxing, practicing. There's a difference between a hobby and a practice, and the difference is roughly that a hobby is what you do with the time left over, and a practice is the thing the rest of the day arranges itself around. And a practice has one property that makes it useful to a man in his position, which is that it's repeatable and it doesn't require the world to be going well. An empire can fall and the water still boils at the same temperature. You can lose your standing, your nation, your sun, and the leaves still need the same 4 minutes. There is something in that which is not consolation exactly, but is close to a flaw, a thing that remains available underneath whatever else has happened. The show is quite disciplined about never saying any of this out loud. But here's the distinction that I think actually matters, and it's the one that separates Iroh from a lot of shallower versions of the same idea. He is not escaping into the small pleasures. He isn't using tea to avoid looking at the world. He knows precisely what the world contains, in detail, because he commanded a 2-year siege of a walled city and watched what that does to everybody involved, including his own family. He has seen it. He isn't retreating from a picture he hasn't looked at. Someone who has never encountered anything difficult telling you to appreciate the small things is offering an untested theory. Someone who has lost the largest thing available to lose, and who then decided that a good cup of tea is worth an afternoon, is offering a conclusion. Those are different objects, and they should not be filed together. And I'll be honest, because these rules matter more when you apply them to your own reactions. The tea stuff isolated slightly annoys me. There is a particular register of internet Iroh that I find difficult. Quotes in a serif font over a picture of a sunset. The uncle-shaped wisdom dispenser. A lot of it strips out everything I've spent this evening talking about, and leaves a nice old man saying nice things about tea. And in that form he's indistinguishable from any number of hollow comfort characters, and I don't blame anyone for finding it a bit much. What redeems it for me is the reverse order of the sentences. The tea is only interesting because of the siege. Take the siege away, and it's a mug with a slogan on it. Put it back, and every cup is a decision somebody made in the ruins of a different life. There's more to his retirement than the shop, and I want to gesture at a few bits because they're delightful. He plays a brass instrument called the tsungi horn, badly, in public, with enormous commitment. He sings, also badly. There's a scene in the first season where he's at a music night and he's the only person having a properly good time, and he's completely untroubled by that. He compliments strangers who have visibly not asked to be complimented and does not adjust when they don't respond. He is, in short, a bit much, and he has clearly decided that being a bit much is preferable to the alternative. And in the comics that continue the story after the show, his contribution to world history is that he invents bubble tea. I want to be clear about how much I enjoy this. The man refused an empire. His actual lasting legacy, in terms of things that change daily life for millions of people, is that he put tapioca in a drink. He arrived at it while messing about, because he'd been messing about for years by that point, and one day the messing about produced boba. There's something almost too neat in that, and I don't care. The great strategist's final gift to civilization is a fun texture. He also, in that same period, keeps doing the thing he did in the alley with the mugger. He collects people, customers become regulars, regulars become friends, and the shop turns into the sort of place where the whole neighbourhood ends up sitting for hours, which is, when you think about it, exactly the same skill that built the Order of the White Lotus, just applied domestically. He's still recruiting. It's just that now the thing he's recruiting people into is an afternoon. And eventually, when he'd had enough of even that, he did something genuinely strange. When Iroh decided he was finished, he did not die in the ordinary way. He left his body behind and went to live in the spirit world. That's the fact, and I want to leave it slightly odd for a moment, because the show that tells us this is very casual about it, and I think it deserves a beat. Some context. The spirit world in this setting is a real, physically reachable place, adjacent to the human one, full of entities that are not people and don't operate on human logic. It's not an afterlife. It's a neighbouring country with strange weather. People have gone there before, The avatar can do it as part of the job, but almost nobody goes there voluntarily and permanently, and certainly not by simply stepping out of their own body one afternoon because they'd finished what they were doing. Iroh apparently worked out how. Nobody explains the method. It's mentioned in passing as something he did, which is a very Avatar way of handling the single strangest thing any character does in either series. The sequel show, The Legend of Korra, is set about 70 years after the war ends. New Avatar, new city, industrial revolution, cars and radios and skyscrapers. Almost everyone from the original series is dead or extremely old. And in the second season, the new Avatar, Korra, gets herself lost in the spirit world in a fairly bad way. She's been stripped down to nothing, she's out of her depth, and she's wandering through a landscape that is actively unfriendly. And she finds a tea house. Iroh is running it. He has, in the decades since he stepped across, opened a shop in the spirit realm and built up a clientele of spirits, several of whom are clearly regulars, and one of whom he's mildly exasperated with. He offers her tea. He's not surprised to see her. He explains, quite matter-of-factly, that he came here when his business in the other world was done, and that he's found it very pleasant. I think it's one of the loveliest character continuations I've seen, and part of why is that it is completely uninterested in being a reward for the audience. He isn't there to deliver a message from the past. He's there because he chose to leave his body behind and live in the spirit world. Greg Baldwin plays him in these episodes, which means the character carries a single, continuous voice across 2 series and the better part of a decade of real broadcast time, from the 3rd season of the original show all the way through, which is a strange kind of achievement given how it came about. He turns up twice more, once when 3 of Aang's now quite elderly children stumble into the spirit world, and he recognises them, having known them as children when he was already an old man, which is a genuinely dizzying bit of arithmetic if you sit with it. And once more when Korra comes back to him, later, with a serious problem and a request for an answer, and he doesn't give her one. He tells her to go and talk to Zuko. I laughed the first time. Nearly a century on, having transcended physical existence, having achieved whatever it is he's achieved, and the technique is unchanged. He asks a question, declines to answer it, and points you at somebody else. He is still refusing to be the authority. He's still redirecting, which is, when you think about it, exactly what he taught his nephew to do, with lightning. And I'm not going to push that comparison any harder because it'll break. There's a legacy detail in that series that I find quietly affecting, and the show barely marks it. Zuko has a grandson. He's a general in the United Forces, the military of a new, multi-ethnic nation, founded on land that the Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom used to fight over. He's competent and decent, and he turns up in an airship at the right moment more than once. His name is Iroh. 3 generations on, in a world with electricity, there is a young man in uniform, carrying the name of an old man who wanted a tea shop. And what strikes me is that the name has become, in that family, a specific instruction. You don't call a child Iroh by accident. You call a child Iroh because you have decided something about what you want them to be. And the thing you want them to be is not Conqueror. Ozai's name doesn't get passed down. Solzin's doesn't. The name that survives in that bloodline is the one belonging to the man who declined everything the family valued. Let's talk briefly about the versions because he's been played by several people now, and the character has proved remarkably difficult to break. There was a live-action film in 2010, directed by M. Night Shyamalan, which is widely and correctly regarded as a disaster. Iroh was played by Sean Toob, and the interesting thing is that he's one of the few elements people don't complain about. The film strips out almost all the humour, which removes about half of what makes the character work, and the performance still holds together. Then there's the Netflix live-action series from 2024 with Paul's son Hyung Lee, which got a considerably warmer reception. That production made an interesting choice with the song, incidentally. Rather than restaging the original scene, they moved the melody to Liu Ten's funeral and played it as an orchestral instrumental with no vocal at all. I think that's a good call. The original recording is the sort of thing that can't be improved on and can very easily be damaged. And the smart move with material like that is to stand next to it rather than on it. What I take from the survival rate is that very little about Iroh depends on plot. Most beloved characters are load-bearing in some structural way. Remove them and the story collapses in a specific place. Iroh could be lifted out of nearly any individual episode, and the episode would still function. What he does isn't plot, it's atmosphere with a spine. He also survives being translated into formats that lose most of the surrounding architecture, which I'd guess is down to the character being mostly made of behaviour rather than circumstance. Take away the magic system, the war, the animation style, and the score, and what's left is still a man who asks questions and doesn't leave the room. That travels. So the tea house in the spirit world is, in its way, the most honest possible ending for him. He did ascend. He relocated and opened the same shop again, and acquired some new regulars, several of whom are not shaped like people. There's a girl alone in a palace, sitting in front of a mirror, cutting her own hair badly with a pair of shears, dismissing servants who have already left the building. She's 14 years old, and she has just been given everything she ever asked for. That's Azula, and this is the part of the story where Iroh doesn't come out of it well. Iroh has a niece, Azula, Zuko's younger sister, and the closest thing the series has to a second antagonist, and by most measures, the most frightening person in it. She's a prodigy. Lightning at 14, blue fire, tactically brilliant in a way that outclasses adults with decades on her. She's also, and the show is careful about this, a child who was raised by Ozai as an instrument. Where Zuko was the disappointment, Azula was the success. And being the success in that household meant being shaped into something with no soft parts. Her father praised her for exactly one thing, and she became exceptional at exactly that thing. And in the third season, she comes apart, properly comes apart, in a sequence that's upsetting to watch, hallucinating her mother and firing everyone in the palace one by one until there's nobody left in the building. Here's the uncomfortable bit. Iroh, who spends years patiently steering one traumatized child out of that family, effectively writes the other one off. He says it plainly. Early in the second season, when Zuko's talking about his sister, Iroh's assessment is that Azula is crazy and she needs to go down. That's the whole diagnosis. There's no plan to reach her, no long game, no version of the treatment he gives Zuko. Later, when the White Lotus is dividing up the final confrontation, he sends Zuko to face her and doesn't offer to try anything else. I've seen people defend this, and some of the defences are decent. She's dangerous in a way Zuko never is. She nearly kills him. There's a moment in the second season where she blasts him in the chest with fire and walks off. And he only survives because Zuko cares for him afterward and refuses Katara's offer to heal him. She very nearly kills the Avatar and does kill him briefly, which the show treats with the seriousness it deserves. She would have exploited any opening he gave her, immediately and without hesitation, because that is what she was built to do. Iroh is a strategist before he is anything else, and he knows what an unwinnable position looks like from the inside. There's also a reading where he's simply protecting the one he can save, rather than losing both, which is the sort of arithmetic that gets done in real families all the time, and is never spoken about afterwards. And I'd add one more thing in his defence, which is that he tried, not hard and not for long, but there are flickers of it in the first season, back when Azula is a distant threat rather than an active one. He speaks about her in the present tense as someone he still knows. Whatever attempt existed happened before we arrive. And there's a reading I find harder to dismiss, which is that he chose. He had one nephew, and one niece, and a finite amount of himself. And he put all of it into the boy, and I don't think it's an accident that the boy is the one who reminded him of his son. Nobody in that show is ever asked to justify that. The story doesn't put the question to him. Zuko never says, "Why did you come for me and not her?" though he'd have been within his rights. What I'd say is that this is the one place where the show's picture of him has a shadow in it. And I'm glad it's there, because a version of Iroh who reaches everybody would be a fantasy object rather than a person. Every real person who is good at something is also, necessarily, not good at some adjacent thing. And the adjacent thing tends to be the one that would have required them to work differently rather than harder. There's a line of thought I keep going round on. Iroh is extraordinarily good at meeting people where they are, and the mugger in the alley is the proof of it. He's willing to sit down with a stranger holding a knife and ask what they'd rather be doing. But Azula never presents a version of herself that has an alley in it. She's armoured at every point of contact, all the way down, from the age of about 9. And the technique Iroh uses depends entirely on the other person eventually being tired enough to let something through. Zuko is exhausted constantly. Azula never lets herself be. So maybe it isn't that he chose. Maybe the method has a failure mode, and she's it. There's a slightly darker version of the same thought, which is that the method requires the other person to want something other than what they've got. Zuko is miserable from the first episode. He wants out of his own life and hasn't got the vocabulary to say so. And that gap is the handhold Iroh works with for 3 seasons. Azula, for most of the run, is winning. She has her father's approval, an army, a crown coming to her. There is no gap. By the time one opens, it opens as a collapse and there is nobody standing nearby who could have used it. I don't fully believe that either. I think there's a bit of both, and I think the show knows and declines to sort it out, which is the same move it makes with a few other things. What this does, usefully, is put a limit on him. Iroh is not a solution. He's a person with one very good approach that works on some people and doesn't work on others, and who has a finite amount of time and appears to have spent it on the nephew he could reach. Most of us are working with something similar. If we're honest, you get 1 or 2 ways of being useful to people, and they land with some and bounce off others, and the ones they bounce off tend to stay with you. There's a small mercy in the later material for what it's worth. The comics pick Azula up afterwards and give her something that isn't quite redemption, but isn't abandonment either, and Zuko keeps trying long after anyone would blame him for stopping, which is arguably Iroh's method, surviving in a person who's better placed to use it than he was. Anyway, I wanted that in here, because I don't think you should spend an evening with someone and only look at the flattering angles. Something I don't think gets said enough about Iroh is that he is, quite deliberately, embarrassing. Not embarrassing in the sense of humiliating himself. Embarrassing in the specific way that older relatives are embarrassing, which is that he has entirely stopped calibrating himself to the room. He sings in public. He sings badly, at volume, without checking whether anyone wants him to. He plays a large brass instrument with more enthusiasm than skill. He wears things that are wrong. He tells long stories with no obvious destination and does not appear to notice when people have stopped listening. In the first season, he goes to a music night on a warship and is visibly the only person present who is enjoying it, and it doesn't occur to him to be self-conscious about that. He gets into a hot spring in the middle of enemy territory. He goes shopping while being hunted. There's a scene where the situation is genuinely urgent, and he stops to comment on the quality of a shop's merchandise. And what's notable is that this isn't presented as senility or as a lack of awareness. He's extremely aware. He's one of the sharpest readers of a room in the entire series, which is why he can defuse a knife fight in 90 seconds. He knows exactly what he looks like. He's just decided it doesn't cost enough to bother about. I think this is genuinely part of the philosophy rather than a texture on top of it. And here's my argument for that. Self-consciousness is expensive. It's a background process that runs constantly in most people, consuming a fair chunk of the available attention, monitoring how you're coming across and adjusting. It's not free. Everything you spend on it is not being spent on the thing in front of you, and the thing in front of you is generally more interesting than the monitoring. Iroh has that process switched off, or at least turned very low, and the visible result is a man with a startling amount of attention available. He notices things nobody else in the scene notices. Which way the wind is going, that the tea has been left too long, that the person opposite him has been quiet for slightly longer than the conversation accounts for. It's the same faculty in every case, and it only works because it isn't being spent on himself. The capacity to be useful to strangers and the willingness to look daft are, I suspect, the same capacity. There's a nice piece of evidence for this in how he handles being recognised. Iroh is, for 2 full seasons, one of the most wanted men alive, travelling under a false name in enemy territory. And his approach to keeping a low profile is to be the loudest and most memorable person in every room he enters. He argues about tea in a shop where he is hiding from an empire. He wins a game against a stranger and celebrates it audibly. You could call that a lapse. I think it's closer to a calculation, and possibly not even a conscious one. Nobody looks for a fugitive general in a man who is embarrassing his nephew in public. The disguise is the personality. There's a specific flavour of this that I find funny, which is his complete indifference to being rebuffed. He compliments people who have made it abundantly clear that they do not want to be complimented, and when they don't respond, he doesn't adjust. He simply goes on. Zuko spends 3 seasons being visibly mortified by his uncle in public, and it changes his uncle's behaviour by precisely nothing. That's a superpower of sorts, and it's one of the very few things about him that I think is straightforwardly imitable. The dragons aren't available, the throne isn't available, nobody's offering me a secret society. But the option of not minding whether you're currently coming across well is on the table for anybody at any moment, and it's just quite hard. Hard in a specific way too. It isn't a decision you make once. Self-consciousness comes back the way a draft comes back, through whichever gap is currently open. And I'd guess Iroh's version took decades and a considerable amount of losing before it stuck. People who genuinely don't mind how they come across have almost always been through something that recalibrated what counts as a bad outcome. Once you've had a properly bad one, looking daft at a music night stops registering. There's a scene I keep returning to for this. Early on, he's on a beach or a deck somewhere, and he's found something small and pleasant, and he tries to get Zuko to look at it. And Zuko will not look. He is furious about the thing he's furious about, and the world has narrowed to that. And his uncle is standing next to him, pointing at a sunset like an idiot. I've been both of those people at different points, and I'd guess most people have. What's true is that the man pointing at the sunset isn't ignoring the situation. He's aware of every dimension of it. He's decided the sunset is also happening. There's one more thing here that I think earns its place, which is that being a bit much is how he stays connected to people. An old man who behaved with perfect dignity would be admired and would be alone. Iroh is not admired mostly, he's liked enormously. People take to him within minutes of meeting him, everywhere he goes, in every nation. And the thing that opens that door is not gravitas. It's that he's slightly ridiculous and completely unbothered about it. And being around somebody like that gives everyone else permission to relax about themselves. Which, if you wanted to be grand about it, is a form of generosity. But he'd probably just say he likes music night, a little bit about the machinery, because I always find this stuff soothing, and it's the sort of thing that suits the small hours. Avatar, The Last Airbender, was created by Michael Dante DiMartino and Brian Konietzko, and it ran on Nickelodeon from 2005 to 2008 across 3 seasons, which the show calls Books, Water, Earth, Fire. 61 episodes, ending with a feature-length finale in July 2008, which is, when you look at it, a very tight run. A lot of long-running animation drifts because there's no end date, and the network keeps ordering more. This had a shape from fairly early on, and you can feel it in how much of the 3rd season is paying off things planted in the 1st. Iroh's structural job in that design is interesting. He exists initially so that Zuko has someone to be watched by. That's it. Zuko's arc requires a witness, somebody who can see what he's doing to himself, so that the audience understands. It's a tragedy rather than just a boy being difficult. Without that character, Zuko in the 1st season is a fairly standard, hot-headed antagonist, and there's nothing to indicate he's going anywhere. So Iroh starts as a device. What happened over 3 seasons is that the device grew a life, which is a thing that occasionally happens in writers' rooms and is generally a sign that everyone involved is enjoying themselves. The voice is a huge part of it, and the story that circulates is that Mako was offered the role without having to audition for it. Whether that's precisely how it went, I couldn't tell you with certainty, but it's completely plausible. And it's the sort of thing that happens when a casting director hears one person's voice while reading a script and can't unhear it. What Mako brings is a quality that's very hard to write in and very easy to lose, which is that his Iroh sounds like a man who has been alive for a long time and is amused by most of it. There's a laugh underneath a lot of his line readings. Not a performed jolliness, a sort of low private amusement, as if he finds the situation faintly ridiculous and doesn't mind. When the character has to go somewhere serious, that same voice barely changes register, and it lands twice as hard for it. You can hear the difference in the writing when they realised what they had. In the 1st season, Iroh's dialogue is largely comic with the occasional pointed remark. By the 2nd, whole scenes are being built around the assumption that this man can carry weight without raising his voice. The tea shop material only works if you trust the actor to make a conversation about brewing feel like it matters. The score is doing a lot of quiet lifting too. Jeremy Zuckerman wrote the music for the whole run, and the approach across the series leans heavily on world instruments rather than the wall of orchestra that a fantasy show would ordinarily reach for. It means the emotional moments tend to arrive small, a single instrument rather than a swell. That's a choice, and it's the right one. And it's why the show is much better than it needs to be at scenes where somebody is simply sad in a garden. Dante Basco plays Zuko throughout, and the two of them together are, for my money, the best double act in the show. There's a rhythm to their scenes where Zuko is always going too fast and Iroh is always going slightly too slow, and neither of them adjusts, and the comedy and the tragedy both live in that gap. One last production note that I like: the character's name is written on screen at one point in Chinese characters, in the Ba Sing Se episode, which is consistent with the show's general habit of putting real written Chinese into the backgrounds and props, rather than inventing a fake alphabet. It's the sort of detail that costs a production real effort, and that most viewers never consciously register. And the accumulation of 1,000 decisions like that is why the world feels like a place, rather than a set. The scheduling of the show is worth a footnote too, because the 3rd season went out in an unusually broken up way, with long gaps and a run of episodes bunched together near the end. Watched week to week at the time, the shape of it would have felt quite different from how it feels now, where the whole thing sits there as a single object you can go through in a fortnight. I suspect Iroh benefits enormously from the binge era. His effect is cumulative, and cumulative effects are much easier to feel when the episodes are 3 minutes apart rather than 3 months. There's one more bit of craft I want to mention because it's the sort of thing you only see on a rewatch. The show is very disciplined about not giving Iroh a speech. He has many monologues. There is no episode where he sits Zuko down and explains his worldview from first principles, which is remarkable given how quotable the character has become, because quotable characters are usually written by people who cannot resist writing the speech. Everything he believes has to be inferred from what he does in ordinary scenes. That's a harder way to build a character, and it's slower, and it means the payoff arrives late, or not at all for a lot of viewers. It's also why he holds up. A speech tells you what someone thinks, behaviour tells you whether they mean it, and the show chose the second one every time it had the option. None of this is necessary to enjoy the character, but I find there's something reassuring about knowing that a thing you like was made by people who were paying attention. There's a sentence that appears under every video, every post, every discussion of this character, and it's some version of, "I wish I had an Uncle Iroh." I've said it myself probably. It's a nice sentence. It's also, the more I look at it, a slightly odd one, and I want to poke at it a bit before we finish. Part of what's going on is straightforward. He's a warm adult who is unconditionally on your side and never withdraws, and a great many people did not have one of those. And noticing that a fictional one exists produces a specific ache. That's not complicated and it doesn't need defending. I'd also say the uncle part is doing work that a parent couldn't. An uncle is family without the authority. He has no power over Zuko, no legal claim, nothing to enforce, and no reputation riding on how the boy turns out. Whatever influence he has is granted rather than assumed, and it can be withdrawn at any moment by a teenager in a bad mood, which it repeatedly is. That's a much weaker position than a father's, and it's precisely why it works. Nothing he says can be dismissed as an instruction, because he isn't in a position to instruct. Fiction has known this for a long time, incidentally. The wise aunt or uncle turns up everywhere, and it's usually because a story needs an adult who can be close to a young person without the friction that a parent brings. What's unusual here is that the show also gives him a full life of his own, that the boy is not the centre of. But there's a second thing underneath it that I think is worth naming, which is that the sentence positions you as Zuko. Always. Nobody ever says, "I wish I could be an Uncle Iroh." And I find that interesting because on the evidence of this evening, the being is considerably more available than the having. You can't arrange to be given a wise uncle. That's luck, and it's distributed unfairly, and no amount of wanting one produces one. But almost everything Iroh actually does is a set of behaviours rather than a set of qualities. Asking a question instead of delivering a verdict. Staying in the room when the other person is being awful. Not making your presence conditional on somebody improving. Being interested in what a stranger would rather be doing. Declining to make yourself the authority. None of that requires wisdom in the mystical sense. It mostly requires being willing to be a bit boring and a bit inconvenient for a fairly long time, which is, I suspect, why we'd all rather be Zuko in the arrangement. I want to be careful here, because there's a version of this that turns into a scolding, and I've no interest in that at 1 a.m. If you're in the middle of something hard, wanting an Iroh is a perfectly reasonable thing to want, and you're not required to convert it into a self-improvement project, but I'd note that the character himself does not seem to have had one. Nobody sat Iroh down. His father ordered a child's death out of pique, and his grandfather started the war, and there's no mentor figure anywhere in his background that the show ever shows us. He put his together out of dragons and old men, and a loss in the way we talked about earlier, and he did it late. Which is the encouraging half, I think. Being given a wise uncle is a lottery. Building one out of parts is at least a process, and processes are available to people who did not win the lottery. And the part of it that matters most is that the assembling seems to happen through being useful to somebody else. He didn't sit down and work himself out, and then apply the results to Zuko. The years with Zuko are where most of it got worked out. The patience was practiced on a specific difficult teenager, in real time, badly at first, which means the two halves of the sentence aren't really separate. Wanting an Iroh and being one are the same activity approached from different ends, and the show's fairly clear that the second end is where the traffic actually moves. I'd add that the results are unglamorous and slow enough that you'd struggle to notice them happening. There is no episode of this show in which Iroh becomes wise. There's no montage, no threshold he crosses. What there is instead is a very long stretch of a man being reliably present for someone who did not want him there, punctuated by naps and complaints about tea. If that were happening to you in your own life, I'm not sure you'd be able to tell. Anyway, I don't want to make too much of it. He'd almost certainly wave this whole line of thought away and offer you a cup of something and ask what you were doing with your Tuesday, which is, I think, the correct response to most attempts at drawing conclusions about a person. And if you were going to take one behaviour off the shelf and try it, I'd suggest the smallest one. Not the forgiveness, which is enormous and took him years. Not the refusal of the throne, which requires a throne. Just the question. The one he asks the man in the alley. And the one he asks his nephew about 40 times across 3 seasons, which amounts to, what is it you actually want, underneath the thing you're currently shouting about? It's a very simple question, and almost nobody asks it, because it's slow and it doesn't resolve anything on the spot, and you have to be prepared to sit through the answer. Somewhere in the upper ring, the shop is still there. Or it was, and then there was another one in a stranger place, and by now the second one has probably outlasted anyone who remembers the first. The picture that stays with me is him at the board, playing tiles against nobody. He did that for years before anyone answered. Sat down, put the white lotus in the middle, and waited to see whether anyone in the room knew what it meant. Most nights, nobody did, and he played the game out anyway. That's the bit I'd take away, if I'm taking one thing. Not the wisdom, which gets quoted a lot and travels badly, the willingness to sit there. Everything else he says has a price behind it somewhere, and the sitting is the only part that's free. There's more of this world I'd like to spend an evening in. Zuko on his own terms, which is a longer and messier story than the one we've told tonight. Azula, who deserves better than the paragraph I gave her. The White Lotus as a subject in itself, and what happened to it once it stopped being secret and became an institution, which is its own quiet tragedy. I'll get to them. For now, though, it's an old man in an apron who was once the most dangerous person in the world, arguing amiably with a customer about steeping times, entirely at peace with being slightly annoying about it. The tea's probably ready. Good night.